The year was 1887. Dawn did not so much arrive in the Red Willow Valley as it bled into existence, a weak gray light that painted the edges of the high clouds. Down below, in the vast, empty cup of the Dakota Territory, the wind had been running for 1,000 miles, and it found its first real obstacle in the solitary ranch house of Alden Pike. The wind hit the raw timber and screamed, a high, thin sound that scoured the land and whipped the silver-gray buffalo grass into a frantic, bowing prayer. Alden Pike was already awake. He had been for an hour, standing by the cold iron stove, listening. He was a man carved from the same hard materials as the land around him, a former cavalryman who had traded his saber for solitude after unspoken losses had burned the noise and ambition out of him. His life was a liturgy of silence, measured by the rising of the sun and the aches in his bones. But this morning, the wind was not the only sound. Through the howl, another noise filtered in, low and rhythmic. It was coming from the barn. It was not the soft huff of his mare or the rustle of hay. It was breath, human breath, draggy and compressed, fighting for air while trying to make no sound at all. It was the breathing of desperation, the sound of prey trying to erase itself from the air. Alden's hand did not go to the pistol on his hip. His movements were slow, measured, ingrained by years of navigating situations where the wrong move meant a spray of blood on the prairie dust. He pulled his thick coat tighter, the wool scratching his neck, and stepped off the porch. The ground was hard, iron hard with the coming winter, and his boots made almost no sound. The barn door was closed, but not barred. He stood beside it for a full minute, just listening. The breathing inside hitched, stopped, then resumed. Faster, shallower. They knew he was there. He eased the door open. The rusted hinge gave a low groan, a sound that seemed deafening in the charged silence. The light from the dawn cut a sharp triangle into the dusty, ammonia-scented gloom. It illuminated 5 women, pressed against the far wall, as if trying to merge with the timber itself. They were a tangle of limbs and terror, frozen like deer about to be shot. They were caked in dirt and river mud, their clothes ripped to rags, scraps of calico and rough-spun wool that offered no protection against the elements or the men they were fleeing. The smell that rolled off them was the acrid tang of pure fear, mingled with old sweat and the metallic scent of exhaustion. His eyes scanned them, taking in the scene with the practiced, detached assessment of his former life. One was hardly more than a girl, Tamsin Hale, shaking so violently she seemed about to fall apart. Another, Joelle Finch, had her knuckles stuffed into her own mouth, biting back a scream. Mercy Lowell had already slumped to the floor, her eyes wide and vacant. Bridget O'Rourke stared past him, her gaze fixed on a horror only she could see. And then there was the one in front. She was not tall, but she held the space for all of them. Her name, though he did not know it, was Mara Quintana. She stood slightly ahead, her body a shield for the others. A thin, white scar, old and clean, ran from the edge of her jaw to her ear. A comma in a story he could not read. Her dark hair was matted, but her eyes were clear. They were not just afraid. They were assessing, calculating, and filled with a profound, bottomless hatred. Mara's gaze flicked from Alden's face, to his hands, to the latch on the back door, and then to the rusted pitchfork hanging on the wall 10 feet away. She was measuring the distance, calculating the cost, ready to turn anything into a weapon. Her fists were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Alden did not move. He did not speak. He saw the calculation in her eyes and respected it. He stood in the threshold, a solid block of a man, letting them see him, letting them see his empty hands. He knew what this was. He had seen this brand of terror before, in the villages burned by men wearing his own blue uniform. He held their terrified gaze for a long count. Long enough for them to see he was not raising a hand, not drawing a weapon. Then, he moved with deliberate slowness. He backed out of the doorway, closing the door until only a small crack remained. They watched him go, their breath held tight. He walked to the pump, The squeak of the handle a sharp cry in the morning. He filled a heavy clay jug with water. He went to his smokehouse, cut a thick slice of dried jerky, and wrapped it in a clean cloth. He returned to the barn door. He did not open it wide. He pushed it just enough to set the jug down on the dirt floor. Right on the threshold line, he placed the wrapped jerky beside it. Through the crack, he spoke. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but steady. He did not command. He did not offer. He stated, "There is water. There is rest. I will be outside." He let the words hang in the dusty air. He saw Mara's eyes narrow, her body tense. This was the part she did not understand. This was the trick. They had all learned the lesson. Carved into their skin and souls, men always demanded something. Kindness was just the bait. A bed was a trap. Food was a down payment on their bodies. Alden did not wait for a reply. He took one step back, then another. And then he did the one thing that undid them completely. He turned his back. He turned his broad back on them, on the open door, on the weapons inside, and walked away. He walked with the steady pace of a man who was not a threat and not threatened. It was an act of profound, almost foolish vulnerability. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any promise. It was a vow. Inside the barn, the silence stretched thin. Mara stared at the jug of water as if it were a coiled snake. The others watched her, their desperate hope a fragile, dangerous thing. Then, Mercy Lowell, the woman on the floor, made a sound, a dry, choking sob. She began to crawl, on her hands and knees, ignoring Mara's hissed, "No." She reached the jug, her hands shaking too badly to lift it. She dipped her head and drank from the spout, gulping the water down like an animal. She drank as if she had been walking through fire for a season, the water spilling down her chin and soaking the front of her torn dress. Mara braced. Tamsin flinched, waiting for the boot to kick, the hand to grab Mercy's hair, the laugh of the man who had tricked them. Nothing came. Mercy drank until she choked, then drank again. And when she finally collapsed beside the jug, weeping brokenly, no terrible thing happened. No price was exacted. That was the moment they broke. Not from the fear, not from the running, but from the kindness that asked for nothing in return. Tamsin slid down the wall, her own silent tears cutting trails through the grime on her face. Joelle finally unhooked her jaw, a low wail escaping her. Mara Quintana remained standing, but the iron in her spine had turned to water. She watched the man, Alden Pike, as he settled onto the porch of the main house. He sat in a wooden chair, facing their direction but not staring, a sentinel keeping watch from a distance. Alden poured himself a cup of coffee from a pot kept warm on a small trivet. He sipped it, the rising sun catching the gray in his beard. He looked at the barn, but his gaze was distant, turned inward. He knew the geography of invisible wounds. He knew the shape of the hole that violence leaves in a person, the kind of damage that doesn't bleed. He sat on his porch, a stranger guarding his own ghosts, and he understood. Far to the east, at the base of the red rock ridges that gave the valley its name, another man was also watching the sun. Burke Latimer, a man who wore the coat of a frontier merchant, but whose trade was in human flesh, checked the tracks on the ground. The trail was clear. He smiled, a thin, precise expression that did not reach his eyes. His property had been spooked, but they were weak, and this was the only ranch with water for 50 miles. He called them his Apache comfort women, a cruel, dismissive label he'd invented. It was a lie, a branding iron of words to mark them as something less than human, something he owned. He mounted his horse, confident. He called them, quite simply, lost cargo, and he was coming to collect. The high prairie night fell like a hammer, absolute and cold. Inside the barn, the darkness was thick, smelling of old hay, dust, and the lingering sharp scent of their own fear. Mara Quintana did not sleep. She sat with her back pressed against the rough-cut board, her spine rigid. She had assigned the others watches, but she knew they were too broken to be reliable. So she watched. Her eyes were fixed on the crack beneath the barn door, the thin line of pale dirt illuminated by the single lamp Alden Pike had left burning on his porch. She hated that light. She hated the wool blankets he had left on the threshold hours ago, a silent offering deposited after the sun had set. She hated the water jug, which Mercy now clung to like a doll. Above all, she hated the hope these things created, a sick, weak fluttering in her stomach. Hope was a trap. Hope was the lull before the violence, the sweet bait that made the snap of the jaws more terrible. She had learned, through bitter, scarring lessons, that nothing was free. Kindness was just a slower, more elaborate form of currency. This man was just being patient. He was waiting for them to be too tired, too grateful, or too weak to fight back. In the deepest dark, Joelle Finch, who had been shivering in a pile of hay, crawled closer. Her voice was a dry rasp, worn thin by days of silence and screaming. Mara didn't turn. Her gaze remained locked on the sliver of light. "Be quiet. He hasn't come in. The blankets. He just left them. He talked through the door." Joelle's words tumbled out, desperate to be believed. What if he's telling the truth? What if he's just a good man? The question hung in the cold air, fragile and absurd. There is no such thing. Mara wanted to spit the words. She wanted to grab Joelle by her matted hair and shake her, to scream that good men were a fairy tale told to children, that out here there were only takers and the taken. This man was just smarter than the others. He was waiting them out. But Mara swallowed the cruel, easy answer. She swallowed it because the same insidious, poisonous question was lodged in her own throat. She, too, had heard him. He had come back as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. They had scrambled into the stalls, huddling behind the mare, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. They had heard his boots stop outside, but the door had not opened. The temperature is dropping. His voice had come through the wood, low and rumbling. Not demanding, not forcing. "I've left blankets. There is a bottle of liniment. If you have bruises or sore feet, I will not come in." He had paused, and they had held their breath. "You are safe in there." He hadn't asked who they were. He hadn't asked what they were running from. He hadn't asked who they belonged to. The absence of those questions felt stranger than any kindness. The questions were always the second part of the violation. Now, in the dark, Mara's certainty was warring with her exhaustion. She finally turned her head. "There is no just kind. Joelle, there is only not yet." But her voice lacked the iron she intended. She, too, was wavering. Tamsin Hale, the youngest, had wrapped herself in 2 of the blankets. The wool was coarse but clean, smelling faintly of soap and cold air. She was pressed against Mercy, her thin body racked by tremors. But as the hours passed, and no boot kicked the door, no drunken shouts echoed from the house, the shivering subsided. Her breathing, which had been shallow and fast for days, finally deepened, catching in small, choked sobs. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Tamsin fell into a true, exhausted sleep. Bridget O'Rourke sat apart from them all, as she always did. She was in the deepest shadow of the hayloft ladder, her knees drawn up. She was not sleeping. She was staring at the wall, her eyes wide, tracking the patterns in the wood grain. She was counting. She was counting her breaths, a silent rhythm to anchor her mind. Inhale for 4 beats, hold for 7, exhale for 8. It was the only thing that kept the memories from flooding in. The sound of men's laughter, the smell of cheap whiskey, the feel of hands that were not her own. She counted to prove to herself that the air was still hers to breathe. On the porch, Alden Pike watched the barn. The lamp cast a small, brave circle of yellow light against the infinite, crushing darkness of the territory. He was not thinking about the women, not directly. He was remembering Lydia, his wife. It had been 5 years since he'd buried her, but the memory was as sharp as a fresh wound. They had been attacked on the road to Shiloh Fork. Drifters, not warriors. Men with dead eyes and a thirst for cruelty. He had fought, taken a bullet in the shoulder, But there were 4 of them. He had failed to protect her. He had gotten her back. But the woman he rescued was not the woman he knew. She had returned to their home, but her spirit had remained on that dusty road. For 6 months, she had lived in a state of profound, terrifying silence. She did her chores, she ate, she slept beside him, but she was a ghost. And one morning, he had found her in the lean-to, hanging from the main beam. She had used a length of his old cavalry rope. That memory was the lock on the door of his life. It had sealed him inside this valley, bound him to this ranch. His quiet existence was not peace. It was a penance. He looked at the barn, at the fragile lives huddled inside, and the debt he owed to Lydia felt heavy as stone. He would not be the man who failed to offer sanctuary. He would not be the man who demanded, who pushed, who broke. As the first gray light touched the horizon, he rose. He went to his workshop and pulled a faded, sun-bleached plank from a pile of scrap. Years ago, he had painted words on it. No trespass. He found a hammer and nails and walked to the main gate of his property, the wind whipping his coat. He nailed the sign back onto the post. It was a flimsy, pathetic gesture. He knew, better than anyone, that a sign only stopped the men who would have respected the line anyway. It was useless against the men who truly needed stopping. But it was a line drawn. Inside the barn, Mara stirred. The jerky was gone, eaten in the cold night, but she had held back half a portion, a hard, dry piece. It was a risk, a stupid gamble, but she had to know. When Alden came with the morning jug of fresh water, he did not open the door. He set it down on the threshold, just as he had before. "Water," he said, as he turned to leave. Mara's voice, hoarse and cracked, stopped him. "Wait." He froze, his back still to her. She forced her trembling legs to move. She cracked the door open, just enough to see his broad back. Her hand was shaking. She threw the piece of jerky onto the dirt at his feet. "We did not want it all," she lied. "It was a test, a rejection, a challenge." She braced for the anger, for the shout, for the proof that his kindness was a sham. Alden looked down at the scrap of meat in the dust. He did not look at her. He stood there for a long moment. Then he gave a single, short nod. "As you wish." He turned and walked back to the house, leaving the jerky where it lay. Mara's knees felt weak. She leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the door. He had accepted her no. He hadn't forced it on them. He hadn't shamed them. An hour later, he returned. He did not mention the meat. He placed a small pot of hot oat mush on the threshold, and beside it, a small, fresh-baked loaf of bread. Mara stared at the steam rising from the pot. He had not touched the jerky she had returned. He had simply added more. A thin, painful crack split the ice in her chest. It was the first one. That night, Alden Pike sat on his porch, the lamp burning beside him. The door to his house, the house where he slept, remained closed. He was offering them a boundary, a clear, unmistakable line of respect. His closed door was a fortress of safety they hadn't known existed, far out on the valley rim, invisible in the darkness. Burke Latimer lowered his spyglass. He had watched the old soldier nail up the pathetic sign. He had watched him carry food to the barn. Burke's men were restless, but he was patient. He let his rivals, he called them his Apache comfort women, a cruel brand he'd invented to dehumanize them, to make the selling easier rest. It was a lie, of course. They were no more Apache than he was. Just women he'd collected, stolen, or bought from lesser, broker men. The label made them exotic, subhuman. It made them property in the eyes of the lawless. He would let them rest. Let them eat. He preferred his merchandise to look healthy. He would collect them in the morning. The second day passed in a strained, humming silence. The women, emboldened by hunger and the absence of violence, had finally retrieved the mush and bread. They ate in the dusty shadows of the barn, passing the loaf with trembling hands, each bite a small, painful resurrection. Then, just before noon, the stillness broke. Mara, who was peering through a crack in the north wall, saw it first. 3 riders, silhouetted against the bright sky, appeared on the high ridge 400 yards out. They were not moving. They were just sitting on their horses, watching the ranch. They were too far to see clearly, but their stillness was a form of violence. It was an occupation of the horizon. One rider was larger than the others, a man who sat his horse with a lazy, arrogant slump. Mara felt the blood drain from her face, her stomach turning to ice. She did not need to see his face. She knew that posture. It was Cole Fenwick, Burke Latimer's right hand, the man who handled the acquisitions and the discipline. They sat there for an hour, an eternity. They were a punctuation mark on the land, a threat written in plain sight. Then, as one, they turned their horses and vanished back over the ridge. They left behind a set of hoof prints and an atmosphere so charged it felt hard to breathe. Inside the barn, Tamsin began to weep, a thin, mewling sound. They know we're here. Be quiet, Mara snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. They were meant to be seen. It's a message. The message was received. Alden Pike had seen them too. He stood on his porch, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the railing, and he did not move until they were gone. He turned and went inside his house. The women heard the sound of metal on metal, a clean, oiled shing as he checked the action of his rifle. At midday, a new figure appeared. This one from the south, riding a fast Appaloosa. It was Ephraim Snow, Alden's only hand, a young man of 20 with a face that had not yet hardened, but whose eyes had. He worked the south range and came to the main house twice a week for supplies. Ephraim pulled his horse up, sensing the wrongness of the air before he even dismounted. He saw Alden on the porch, but Alden was not sitting. He was standing, his weight balanced, and the rifle, a heavy 16-shot Henry, was leaning against the doorframe, not hanging on the wall. Ephraim swung down from the saddle, his eyes darting from Alden to the silent barn, and then up to the ridge where the hoof prints had been. He didn't have to ask what was wrong. How many, Ephraim asked, his voice low, pulling his own rifle from its saddle scabbard. Saw 3 on the ridge, Alden said, his voice flat. But there will be more. Burke Latimer's men. Ephraim's jaw tightened. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Burke Latimer was a shadow, a purveyor of goods that no decent person spoke of in the light. What's he after? Ephraim asked, his gaze settling on the barn. He could hear a faint sound from within, a muffled sob. Alden met the young man's eyes. There was no room for lies between them, not with what was coming. 5 women. They are in the barn. Ephraim looked at the barn, then back at Alden. His face was a mask of calculation. He was processing the arithmetic of the situation. 5 women, 2 men, and Burke Latimer. The odds were long. He did not ask who they were, or how they had gotten there, or why Alden had taken them in. In this land, those questions were luxuries. There was only one question that mattered. When do you figure they'll come? Ephraim asked. Before dawn, Alden said. It's what they always do. All right, Ephraim said, as if Alden had just told him a fence was down. I'll get the mare and my horse into the small corral. No sense leaving them in the barn. He nodded toward the barn. They know, Alden replied. The quiet, practical exchange was more terrifying to Mara than any shouting would have been. She had watched it all through the crack. She had seen the young one, Ephraim, arrive. She had seen him ready his rifle without a moment's hesitation. She saw the set of Alden's jaw. These men were not debating what to do. They were not considering handing them over. They were preparing for a war. A cold, different kind of fear washed over her. It was the fear of trusting. She had built her entire survival on the absolute certainty that no one would ever stand for her. This was a crack in the foundation of her world. She turned to the others, who were huddled in the hay, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. He's here, she said, her voice flat and dead. I saw Fenwick on the ridge. That means Burke is close. Mercy let out a choked sound. There is no more running, Mara continued, her voice gaining a hard, brittle strength. The house is there. The barn is here. This is all the ground there is." She looked at each of them, forcing them to meet her gaze. "We have a choice. We can hide in the hay and wait for them to burn us out. Or we can stand." Joelle looked up, her eyes wide with a desperate, nascent spark. "Stand. Stand with him. Stand for ourselves," Mara corrected, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The afternoon bled away. The sun began its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and red. Alden and Ephraim did not rest. They boarded up the north-facing windows of the house. They moved a water barrel to the porch. They worked in a rhythm of shared, unspoken understanding. As the light thickened, Alden walked from the house to the barn. He stopped at the threshold. He was carrying a small wooden crate. He set it down, just as he had with the food. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice directed at Mara. She moved to the door, pressing her face to the crack. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Alden said, his voice resonating through the wood. "This isn't your fight. It's my land and my choice. I will stand." He paused, and she heard him take a deep breath. "But if you choose to, if you find yourself wanting to, there is a box here. It has 3 old Navy pistols and some ammunition." He pushed the box forward with his boot. It scraped on the dirt, stopping just inside the threshold. "I will not ask you to hold a gun," he said, his voice dropping. "But I will not be the man who denied you the choice." He turned and walked away, his back a rigid line of resolve. Inside, Joelle began to sob, a raw, racking sound. "He's going to die. They're going to kill us all." "Maybe," Mara said. She was staring at the box. Can we stand with him?" Joelle whispered, the question directed at Mara, at God, at the dusty air. "Is that allowed?" Mara did not answer. "From the threshold." Alden's voice came one last time, quiet but carrying. "You can, when you want to." The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the world was plunged into a deep, cold purple. And in that twilight, a new light appeared. On the ridge where the riders had been, a fire bloomed, and then another, and another, a line of campfires, blazing in the darkness. Burke Latimer had arrived. He was not hiding. He was making a statement. He was setting up his camp just out of rifle range. A clear, arrogant message. "I am here. You are mine. I will collect my property in the morning." The fires were a taunt, a promise of the dawn. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of their wood smoke and a hint of rain. The prairie night settled in, vast and indifferent. The stars emerged, cold and bright, observers to a drama of profit and loss, of cowardice and courage, of sin and redemption, all to be played out on a tiny, blood-soaked stage. The string was pulled tight. It was vibrating. The night was a vast, cold ocean, and the campfires on the ridge were the mocking lights of a distant, hostile shore. Alden Pike sat on his porch, the yellow lamplight at his elbow pushing back against the dark, but only just. His Henry rifle lay across his knees, the oiled walnut stock smooth and familiar under his palms. Ephraim was in the house, moving from window to window, a silent shadow checking the horizon. Inside the barn, the box of pistols sat open. No one had touched it. The women were huddled in the hay, a knot of shared terror, their breathing the only sound. Mara Quintana stood at the barn door, staring across the 30 yards of open, moonlit ground to the man on the porch. He had not called for her. He had not demanded anything. He was simply waiting for the dawn, and for the death it would bring. She had spent 2 days in his shadow, fed by his hand, protected by his unspoken promise. And now he was going to die for them. The thought was absurd, illogical, and it cut against the grain of every brutal lesson life had taught her. Men did not die for women like her. They died on them, or while taking from them. This old man was a fool, or he was something else. She had to know which. She pushed the barn door open. The creak was loud in the night. The women behind her gasped. Alden's head came up, his hand moving to the rifle, but he did not raise it. He just watched her, Bar it behind me, Mara said to Joelle, her voice a low command. Do not open it, for anyone. She stepped out into the cold. The wind hit her instantly, pulling at her ragged clothes. The ground was hard under her worn boots. Every step across that open yard felt like a mile. She was exposed. The fires on the ridge seemed to wink at her, a dozen red eyes enjoying her vulnerability. She kept her hands in plain sight, away from her body. She did not walk to him, but to the far end of the porch. She sat on the top step, a full body's length away from his chair. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. Her hands, clasped together, rested on her shins, as if she were asking permission from herself to be there. They sat in silence for a long time, two quiet figures in a small pool of light, surrounded by a wilderness of enemies. The only sounds were the wind and the distant, nervous stamp of a horse. Finally, Mara spoke, her voice low and rough. She did not look at him. She looked at the fires. You're a fool, Alden Pike. He did not react. This is not your fight. You don't know us. You don't know what we've done, or where we've been. Why? Why wait here to die for 5 strangers? She finally turned her head, her gaze sharp in the lamplight. What do you get from this? What's your trade? Alden was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the dark ridge. No trade, he said, his voice a low rumble. A payment to my past. He shifted in his chair, the wood groaning. I had a wife, Lydia. He said the name as if it were a fragile, precious thing he had not held in a long time. We were on the road to Shiloh Fork, coming back from town. 4 men, drifters. He stopped. Mara waited. The silence stretched, filled by the things he was not saying. I fought, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. But there were 4 of them. I got her back. We came home, right here, to this house. He reached out and touched a porch beam next to him. Mara could see, in the lamplight, a deep, gouged scar in the wood, a groove worn smooth by time. She was quiet. She lived. She ate. She mended my clothes. But she was quiet. For 6 months. She barely spoke a word. She'd just stand at that window, watching the road. His voice grew softer, rougher. One morning, I came out here for coffee, and she had used a length of rope. Right there. He rubbed his thumb along the scar in the beam. It cut my life in 2. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She looked from the scarred wood to the man. She had been thinking in terms of currency, of trades, of profit and loss. She had been assessing him as a customer, a threat, or a mark. In that moment, she was no longer cargo. She was not evidence. She was not a victim to be catalogued. He was not looking at her with pity, or hunger, or calculation. He was simply showing her his own wound, a wound as deep and as permanent as any of hers. She was a person, sitting on a porch with another person, and they were both survivors of a war. That's why, he said, as if reading her thoughts. I never stepped foot in that barn. She looked at him, confused. The day you arrived, I never crossed the threshold. He nodded toward the barn, its dark shape a comfortless shadow. That door, that wood was a line. It was a line you controlled, not me, a person. A person needs a line they can control, a place where no one can just walk in. Mara's entire body ached. She realized that for 2 days, she had been learning a new language. She had thought his actions the distance he kept, the way he turned his back, the way he left the food and walked away. The placement of his gun so it was never, ever pointed in their direction was weakness or a trick. She saw it now. It was not a trick. It was a language, a vocabulary of respect, spoken with footsteps and closed doors and turned backs. It was the only language of safety she had ever known. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was not an empty, cold space. It was a shared one. Tamsin, Mara said, her voice barely a whisper. Alden looked at her. The youngest one. Her name is Tamsin. Mara kept her gaze on the dark ridge. The one who cries is Joelle, the one who who was lost inside. That's Bridget, the one who drank the water first. She's Mercy. She paused, the list complete. A gust of wind hit the porch, making the lamp flame gutter. She had named them, bringing them out of the category of property and back into the world of the living. She had almost forgotten the last one. And I am Mara. Alden Pike nodded, slowly. Mara, he said. He tested the name, gave it weight. It was not an act of possession. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. This was not a bond of debt or of gratitude. It was the simple, profound connection of two people who had chosen to stand on the same small patch of ground. The screen door of the house creaked open. Ephraim Snow stepped out, his young face tight with urgency. He kept his voice low, but it cut through the night. Alden, the fires. Alden and Mara both looked. The ridge was black, the mocking. Distant campfires were gone. They're out, Ephraim said, stating the obvious. Alden stood up in one smooth, practiced motion, picking up the Henry rifle. The night was suddenly, terribly, quiet. The wind had died down. The enemy was no longer advertising its position. They were moving. They'll come before the dawn, Alden said. They're on their way now. He looked at Mara. His face was grim, but calm. He pointed with his chin to a low, slanted double door set into the ground near the side of the porch. That's the root cellar. It's deep, dug into the rock. They could burn this house to the ground and they would not find you. He looked her square in the eyes. You take the others. You get in there. You bar it from the inside. You will live. That is your choice. If you want to live, you choose that. He chambered around into the Henry, the click-clack of the mechanism sounding as loud as a cannon shot in the stillness. But me and the boy, he said, nodding to Ephraim, who now stood beside him with his own rifle. We're staying. We stand. We stand by the honest law of this land. He turned away from her, facing the darkness, facing the oncoming tide. He had given her the choice. Life in a dark hole, or something else. Mara stood up. She looked at the cellar door, a black square promising survival. A return to the life of hiding, of running, of being cargo that had gotten away. Then she looked at the two men, their backs to her, two rifles aimed at the dark. She turned and walked, not to the cellar, but back across the 30 yards of open ground to the barn. The gray-black of the sky was turning, a faint, bruised purple appearing on the eastern horizon. This was the hour of murder, the cold crack of time between night and day, when men's souls were at their lowest ebb and their courage at its weakest. But not Alden Pike's. He stood on the porch, a solid, unmoving shadow. The lamp at his elbow had burned low, its fuel almost spent, but it still cast a small, defiant circle of yellow. Ephraim was inside the house, his rifle resting on the sill of the kitchen window, his position covering the north approach. Mara had not gone to the cellar. When she had returned from the barn, she had walked to the kitchen door. Alden had watched her come. She had stopped, her hand hovering near the latch, a silent question. He had given a single, short nod. She had entered his house. She was standing just inside the main room, back from the light. But she had seen it all. She had seen Ephraim take his post. She had watched Alden step outside, his rifle held in the crook of his arm, a picture of deadly patience. The other women were with her, huddled by the cold stove, their fear a palpable thing in the small, dark space. Joelle was holding one of the old Navy pistols, her two hands wrapped around the grip. The barrel pointed at the floor. Then came the sound. Not a charge, not a yell. The slow, confident, rhythmic beat of horses walking on hard-packed earth. It was the sound of masters coming to collect, a sound of absolute, unhurried arrogance. They emerged from the darkness, phantoms taking shape. Burke Latimer was in the lead, riding a tall black mare. He was dressed in a fine merchant's coat, as if arriving for a Sunday meeting. To his right was Cole Fenwick, a mountain of a man, his duster failing to hide the sawed-off shotgun he held. 4 other riders fanned out behind them, their faces hard, anonymous, their rifles held ready across their saddles. They stopped 30 yards from the porch, just outside the ring of lamplight. Burke Latimer smiled, a thin, polished expression. His voice was not a shout. It was a reasonable, negotiating tone, as if discussing a bill of lading. "Good morning, sir. I am here for my property. I will have it returned." He held up a rolled parchment. "I have the deeds of transport. I have witnesses. I suggest you make this simple." Alden Pike did not move, save for his voice. He did not step back into the shadow. He remained in the light, a single, immovable object. "On my land." Alden's voice was a low growl. "People are not property." A short, ugly laugh came from Cole Fenwick. He unrolled a separate, grimy piece of paper. "He's a reader, Mr. Latimer. Maybe he'd like to hear the ledger." Cole's voice was a gravelly roar, a mockery of his boss's refinement. "Item for keep of 5 head, 2 months. Item for clothing and transport. Item for medicinal care." He looked up, his grin a pale slash in the gloom. "This here is a legal matter. Old man, you are interfering with a registered business. Every word on this paper is a chain, and it's a chain the law recognizes." The kitchen door creaked. The sound was shockingly loud. It was not the shriek of a rusted hinge, but the solid groan of well-oiled iron. Mara Quintana stepped out of the house. She did not look at Alden. She did not hide behind him. She walked onto the porch and stood beside him, a full pace away. She was unarmed. Her hands were empty at her sides. She was wearing one of Lydia's old coats, a coat that hung on her small frame but covered her rags. She did not look down. She did not cry. She locked her eyes on Burke Latimer. Burke's smile faltered. The parchment in his hand tightened. This was not in his calculation. Property did not stand. Property did not look back. He recovered, his voice losing its polish, replaced by a merchant's impatience. "I see, a benefactor." He sneered. "Well, I'm a reasonable man." He gestured toward the women he could now see huddled behind Mara in the doorway. "Let us barter. You are clearly a man of charity." He pointed a gloved finger. "Give me the 2 older ones, the one with the scar, and the dark-haired one. You can keep the 3 younger ones. Call it a finder's fee. Easier to please a benefactor, and I am saved the trouble of breaking in new stock." The words were a violation, a casual sorting of human flesh. Alden Pike did not answer. He moved. It was a slow, deliberate, and final motion. He brought the Henry rifle up, not to his shoulder, but to his waist. He leveled it, the barrel pointing directly at the center of Burke Latimer's expensive coat. It was a line drawn in the pre-dawn air. "There is no haggling over human beings," Alden said, his voice now devoid of all warmth, all patience. It was the voice of the grave. Cole Fenwick shifted, his shotgun coming up slightly. Big words. "Old man, you know who you're talking to?" "One of the other riders." Nervous, leaned forward. "I know who he is," the rider whispered. "Just loud enough to carry, that's Pike, the one from Shiloh, the one whose wife." Cole Fenwick's eyes lit up with a sudden, vicious understanding. He laughed, a real, booming sound this time. "Pike, that's right. He's just like you. Pike can't hold on to his women. Can he?" He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dripping with venom. "Tell me, old man, how did that rope feel on the beam? You must have gotten a good, close look at her face." The air turned to glass. Alden's knuckles went white on the rifle stock. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables. A single, convulsive tremor ran through his hand. He was on the edge, the black, blind rage that Burke had been waiting for. A blind shot was a missed shot. A blind shot was a trap. He took one, single, shuddering breath, and he held. His hand did not shake. The barrel did not waver. It remained locked on Burke's heart. A gust of wind tore across the yard, whipping Mara's hair across her face and making the lamplight gutter wildly. The thunderous silence that followed was broken by the nervous whinny of a horse. The 4 riders behind Burke shifted. They looked at the unwavering rifle. They looked at the second rifle now clearly visible in the kitchen window. They looked at Cole's ugly grin and at Burke's pale face. They had come to round up terrified, unarmed women. They had not come to die in a meaningless, two-front gunfight against a fortified ex-cavalryman who looked like he had already made his peace with God. Into that silence, Mara spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was not a plea. It was not a scream. It was clear, cold, and it cut through the air sharper than any bullet. She was still looking at Burke. "I do not belong to you anymore." It was done. The spell was broken. The ledger was meaningless. The chains were rust. Burke Latimer saw it. He saw the wavering in his men's eyes. He saw the cold, murderous calm in Alden's. He saw the woman who was no longer property. He had lost. He stared at Alden for one more second, his face a mask of pure, reptilian hatred. He would not give the order to fire. He would not die for this. Not today. He pulled his horse's head around. A violent, angry motion. "This is not finished. Pike," he spat, "this is a long debt. I will collect." He turned his horse. Cole Fenwick, his face dark with fury, hesitated, then followed. The others, visibly relieved, wheeled their mounts and kicked them into a run. The sound of retreating hoofs faded into the darkness, swallowed by the vast, indifferent prairie. Alden, Mara, and Ephraim stood unmoving, listening, until there was nothing left to hear but the wind and the first, hesitant song of a waking bird. The dawn was coming. The sound of the hooves vanished, eaten by the wind. For a full minute, no one moved. There was no sound but the high, thin cry of the breeze and the first, hesitant chirp of a prairie bird. The world was holding its breath. Then, the iron that had held Mara Quintana's spine rigid for 3 days, for a lifetime, turned to water. Her knees buckled. She did not fall, but she sank, her legs giving way. Her right hand shot out, not to a weapon, but to the rough wood of the porch floor, her palm slapping flat against it as if to feel the solid, impossible reality of the ground that was still beneath her. She was alive. She was free. The kitchen door was still open. The first sound from inside was a small, broken gasp. Tamsin Hale, the youngest, stumbled out, her eyes wide and blank, her face a mask of tearless shock. She saw Mara on her knees and she crumpled, falling against Mara's side, her arms locking around Mara's waist in a desperate, clinging grip. Joelle followed, the heavy Navy pistol still in her hand. She looked at the gun as if she had no idea how it had gotten there. She let it fall. It hit the porch with a heavy, final thud. She didn't make a sound, but she slid down the door frame, her shoulder pressing into Tamsin's back, creating a small huddle of shared gravity. Mercy Lowell came last. She walked past the others, her step stiff and uncertain. She went to the far porch railing, gripped it with both hands, and looked out at the new, pale blue dawn. She stood there for a 10 count, and then she let out a sound that did not seem human. It was not a cry, but a wail, a long, tearing, animal sound that she had been holding inside for months. It was the sound of a dam not just breaking, but being obliterated. She had been the first to drink the water, and she was the first to let the grief out. Her sobs were not quiet. They were loud, racking, ugly howls of pain and release, and they tore through the quiet morning air. Inside the doorway, Bridget, the silent one, did not move. But as Mercy's wail hit its peak, Bridget's shoulders, which had been permanently hunched in terror, suddenly dropped. She let out her breath. It was not a sigh. It was a violent, shuddering exhalation that seemed to start at her feet, a gale force of air she had been holding in her lungs for a year. She gasped, taking in a new, clean breath, and then let it out again. She was breathing, as if for the first time. On the porch, Alden Pike had not moved. He still held the Henry. He watched this knot of women collapse into each other. He heard the raw, agonizing sound of Mercy's grief. He did not step toward them. He did not offer a word. He knew this was not his moment. This was not for him. This was a sacred, terrible ceremony that he had no right to interrupt. He lowered the rifle, resting its butt on the porch. He stepped off the wood, down onto the cold dirt of the yard. He gave them the porch. He gave them their space. Ephraim Snow emerged from the kitchen, his own rifle still in his hands. He looked at the women, at Mercy's raw grief, at Mara's shaking back, at Tamsin's silent, clinging terror. He looked at Alden, who was standing in the yard, his back to the house, a silent guardian. Ephraim's face, usually so young and hard, crumpled. He laid his rifle gently against the house wall. He did not make a sound, but his shoulders began to shake. He leaned his forehead against the rough timber, and his own silent. Bitter tears began to water the dust at his feet. The sound of the crying began to change. The first wave had been the sharp, high-pitched shriek of panic and relief. We are alive. But as the sun climbed higher, painting the clouds in brilliant, painful strokes of gold and rose, the sound deepened. It became a different, lower, more profound sound. It was the sound of mourning. They were not just crying because they had been saved. They were crying for what they had lost. Tamsin was weeping for the girl she had been, a girl who could laugh, a girl who had never known the touch of a cruel hand. Joelle was sobbing for her family, for the home she would never see again. Mercy was wailing for the years, for the time itself, for the dignity that had been stripped from her, piece by piece, until she had almost forgotten her own name. It was a funeral. They were mourning their own stolen lives, their erased identities. Mara was the last to make a sound. She was shaking, her body absorbing the sobs of the women clinging to her. She raised her head. Her face was wet, but she was not howling. Her tears were silent, hot. She looked across the yard at the man who stood with his back to them. She waited until a wave of Mercy's sobs had passed, leaving a small, quiet pool of air. Her voice was a dry whisper, a piece of broken gravel. "Thank you." Alden did not turn. He did not speak. He just gave a single, short nod, acknowledging the two words. It was the first time in her life she had used those words and meant them as more than a shield. It was not a transaction. It was a return. It was her re-entry into the human race. That night, they did not sleep in the barn. Alden had spent the day in a quiet, methodical rhythm. He had not pushed them. He had let them grieve, let them sit on the porch for hours, talking in low, broken whispers. He had simply cooked a large pot of stew, the smell of broth and herbs filling the air. He had laid out tin plates on the kitchen table, and when night fell, he did not herd them inside. He brought 5 thick, clean blankets from his supply chest. He did not place them on the beds. He did not assign them places. He stacked them on a wooden chair near the kitchen door. He set up cots and pallets in the main room, but he spaced them far apart. And he left the kitchen door, the one Mara had come through, propped open. He was speaking their new language. The blankets were there, if they chose to take one. The beds were there, if they chose to sleep in them. And the door was open, if they felt trapped and wanted to return to the known safety of the barn. Everything, every single gesture, was designed to say one thing: the choice is yours. Tamsin was the first, taking a blanket and curling up on the pallet closest to the fire. Joelle and Mercy took cots near each other. Bridget sat in the rocker, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the fire, her breath still coming in those slow, measured rhythms. Mara took the last pallet, the one near the open door. Alden and Ephraim did not sleep in the house. They took their bedrolls to the barn, giving the women the fortress. Before the sun had risen, Alden was up. The women were still sleeping, an exhausted, dead sleep. He moved with purpose. He took a rake and smoothed the dirt of the yard, covering the tracks, the scuffs, the fallen pistol. He gathered the empty cartridges. He stacked the firewood neatly, covering the main pile with a heavy tarp. He was erasing the signs. He was not giving Burke Latimer, or any passing scout, a reason to see this ranch as a target, or as a place of weakness. He was removing the bait from the trap. He went inside, in the cold light of the dawn. He sat at his small, scarred wooden desk. He pulled out a piece of paper, a bottle of ink, and a pen. He began to write. His handwriting was clear, strong, and economical. He was not writing to the local sheriff. He was writing to Judge Loring in Shiloh Fork. He wrote of a man named Burke Latimer, who was trafficking in human lives. He wrote of fraudulent bills of sale and false deeds of transport, using the very language Cole Fenwick had been so proud of. He was not making an emotional appeal. He was building a legal case. He was turning Burke's paper chains into a paper noose. When Ephraim came in from checking the horses, Alden was folding the letter. "Ephraim," he said, his voice low, "I need you to ride to Shiloh Fork." Ephraim nodded, understanding the gravity. Now. Alden handed him the letter. "Give this to Judge Loring himself, no one else. Tell him I said the debt has come due." Ephraim tucked the letter inside his coat. "The Appaloosa." "No," Alden said. "Take the chestnut mare. She's the fastest horse I own. And do not take the main road." He pointed south. "Take the creek bed. Follow it down to the split rock. Then cut east. It's slower, but no one will see you. Burke's men may have retreated, but they are not gone." Ephraim nodded. He took a canteen of water and a piece of bread, and was gone in 5 minutes. Alden stepped onto the porch, wiping his inky hands on a rag. He looked up at the ridge. The cold, gray light of morning showed it to be empty. The campfires were gone. The smoke had vanished. Burke Latimer had pulled back, but his presence lingered, a poison in the wind. This was not an end. It was an armistice, and Alden Pike had just fired the first shot in a new kind of war. The days that followed Ephraim's departure on the chestnut mare settled into a strange, new rhythm. The immediate, suffocating terror of the dawn attack had passed, but the threat from the ridge remained, a silent, invisible weight on the air. Burke Latimer was gone, but he was not finished. This was not an end. It was a pause. This vacuum was what Mara Quintana moved to fill. She had spent a lifetime surviving, reacting to the next blow. Now, in this quiet valley, she was faced with something far more terrifying a future. She saw the other women adrift, ghosts haunting the corners of Alden's small, safe house. They would do their chores, wash the plates, sweep the floor, but their eyes were distant, their movements mechanical. They were waiting for the next horror. Mara knew that idleness was a kind of grave. If they waited, their memories would bury them. On the third morning, she stepped into the role she had been born for, not as a fugitive, but as an architect. She began to organize the ranch as if it were a small, defiant plantation of hope. She started with Bridget. The silent one had not spoken a word, but her eyes, which had been fixed on a point in the middle distance, had begun to track movements. Mara led her to the cold iron stove. She placed a stack of dry kindling in Bridget's lap, then a matchbox. "We need fire," Mara said, her voice gentle but firm. "You will be the one who brings it." Bridget stared at the small wooden sticks. Her hands, which had been permanently curled, slowly unfurled. She fumbled with the match. The first one snapped. The second scraped, failed to light. Her breath hitched. Mara did not help. She waited. Bridget struck the third match. A small, sulphurous whoosh of flame erupted, and in that tiny, orange light, Bridget's vacant gaze focused. She touched the flame to the tinder. The wood sputtered, smoked, and then caught. A small, clean fire began to crackle. Bridget did not move. She sat on the floor, watching the flame, as if witnessing a miracle. For the first time, her eyes had a fixed, warm point to rest upon. Joelle, whose hands had not stopped trembling since they arrived, was next. Mara took her outside to the small, neglected kitchen garden behind the house. The ground was hard, the weeds thick. "This is yours," Mara said, handing her a heavy hoe. Joelle looked at the tool, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the handle. I can't?" "Yes, you can," Mara said. "The earth doesn't judge, it just waits." Joelle's first efforts were clumsy, her tremors making the hoe skip and glance off the packed soil. But the work was hard, and it demanded everything. Her fear, her memories, they had no place in the rhythm of raising the heavy tool and letting it fall. She worked until her hands were raw, until her back screamed, until the trembling in her arms was from exhaustion, not terror. Day after day, she returned. She pulled weeds, her fingers finding a new strength in the rich, dark soil. She began to carve long, straight, perfect rows, each one a lifeline, a testament to hands that were, finally, becoming steady. Tamsin, the youngest, was given the barn. She flinched at first, the memory of huddling in the dark hay still too sharp. So Mara brought the work to her, on the sunlit porch. Alden's tack was in disrepair, a bridle with a snapped rein, a saddle with stiff, cracked leather. "These are broken," Mara said. "You will fix them." Alden showed her. Just once, how to mix the linseed oil and wax, how to thread the heavy leather needle. Tamsin's small, chapped fingers were clumsy with the awl, but she was meticulous. She bent over the work, her brow furrowed in concentration. The smell of the tack was sharp. Clean bite of the oil, the animal scent of the leather, the salt of her own sweat as she pulled the stitches tight. It was not the smell of fear. It was the perfume of purpose. It was the smell of her own freedom. Mercy, who had been broken by men, found her healing in the one creature on the ranch who was as wary as she was. Alden's white mare, the one from the barn, was a nervous, flighty animal, distrustful of his quick, practical movements. Mercy began to simply stand in the corral. She did not approach. She just stood, for an hour at a time, her body still, her hands loose at her sides. Then, she began to talk. Her voice was low, a soft, meaningless murmur, a current of sound against the wind. The horse, which had been stamping in the far corner, stopped, one ear swiveled back. Mercy kept talking. After 2 days, the mare took a hesitant step toward her, then another. Mercy did not reach out. She waited. The mare finally lowered its great white head and touched its soft muzzle to Mercy's shoulder. Mercy's hand, scarred and trembling, came up to stroke the warm neck. It was the first living thing she had touched in a year that had not caused her pain. Her voice, once small and broken, became the only thing that could calm the high-strung animal. She, who had been prey, had become a sanctuary. Alden Pike watched all of this, and he understood. He had offered them a fortress, but Mara was building them a home. He did not interfere. He was a visitor in his own house, a quiet observer of this new, feminine order. One evening, he came into the kitchen as Mara was scratching in his supply ledger with a stub of charcoal, her lips moving as she counted sacks of flour. He sat across from her. She tensed, expecting him to take the book, to correct her. Instead, he pushed his small tin of cash, a few dollars and a handful of coins across the table. "You'll need this for the supply run. We're low on salt and coffee." Mara looked at the money, then at him. "Why are you giving this to me?" He met her gaze. His voice was quiet, but it held the weight of a vow. "Because this house trusts the person holding the pen." It was not a gift. It was a transfer of power. It was a gentle, profound, and absolute surrender of his solitude. In that moment, Mara Quintana was no longer a refugee. She was the matron of the Red Willow Ranch. Ephraim returned 10 days later, riding the chestnut mare to a lather. He brought news. Judge Loring had received the letter and had sent a one-word reply, delivered to Ephraim verbally, "Good." But Ephraim also brought news from the trail. He had spoken to freighters at a way station. Burke Latimer's entire northern business, a lucrative string of comfort houses near the mining camps, had collapsed. The gold vein had played out, and the camps had moved on. Burke was a merchant whose inventory was suddenly worthless, and he was enraged. He was back in the territory, gathering his old crew. "But he ain't just talking about a raid." "Alden," Ephraim said, his young face grim. "He's talking about lawyers. He's telling everyone he's got contracts and bills of sale. He's going to use the law." The news settled a new, cold dread over the house. The next day, Alden and Ephraim took them to the back pasture, far from the house. They laid the 3 old Navy pistols on a blanket. He'll try the law first, Alden said, his voice flat. But men like him always have a second plan. He looked at each of them. You do not have to touch these, ever. But what happened before, that was helplessness. This is choice. He and Ephraim did not yell. They did not push. They taught them the rules of safety. They taught them how to load, how to aim, how to control their breathing, to save on precious lead. They had carved several small, rough bullets from hardwood. When Tamsin's hands shook, Alden simply steadied them. When Joelle flinched at the small pop of the wooden plug, he just told her to try again. It was not an act of trauma. It was an act of reclamation. That night, Mara sat at the table, the ledger open, the cash tin beside it. "He's coming with paper," she said, her voice quiet. "His proof." Alden nodded, cleaning the barrel of his Henry. "His word against yours. And out here, he's a man with money. That makes his word heavy." Mara looked up from the ledger, her eyes catching the lamplight. They were not the eyes of the cornered animal from the barn. They were the eyes of a general. "Then we have to strike first," she said. "Not with guns, not by running." She tapped the ledger. "With the truth, with our proof." Alden stopped cleaning the rifle. "What do you mean, Mara?" "He will come with a list of expenses and contracts," Mara said, her voice cold as ice. "We will meet him in that courtroom. We will bring our own story. He has a name for us, this Apache Comfort. We will tell them our real names. We will tell them the names of the other women. We will drag his entire black market, every ledger, every contract, out into the sun." Alden Pike looked at her for a long time. The man who was paying a debt to his past was gone. In his place was a man looking at a partner. He gave a slow, final nod. "All right, Mara, we'll give them back their names, and then we'll pull the curtain on his whole damn show." A few weeks had passed. The rhythm of the ranch had taken hold. A quiet, domestic heartbeat set against the drumbeat of the coming legal war. The women were no longer ghosts. Joelle's garden was thriving under the late autumn sun. Bridget's fires never went out. Tamsin's repairs on the tack were meticulous, and Mercy's voice was the only one the white mare would obey. Tonight, a cold rain had set in, a steady, whispering drum roll on the shake roof of the ranch house. It was late. The rest of the house was deep in a sleep that was, finally, trusting. In the main room, by the light of a single flickering oil lamp, Mara and Alden sat at the kitchen table, the ledger open between them. The air was filled with the smell of wet pine, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of coffee grounds. They were working late, auditing their meager supplies, planning for the trip to Shiloh Fork, their heads bent close together over the columns of charcoal figures. "We have 3 sacks of flour," Mara murmured, her finger tracing the line. "But the salt is low. If we buy a full bag—" "We can't," Alden said, his own calloused finger moving to a different column. "Not if we need to buy shot for the—" As he moved his hand, the back of his fingers brushed the back of hers. It was nothing, a simple, accidental graze of skin on skin. But in the charged, quiet space, it felt like a bolt of lightning. Both of them recoiled, snatching their hands back as if they had touched a hot stove. The air, which had been comfortable and practical, was suddenly electric, humming with a new, unspoken tension. A long, painful silence stretched. Mara stared at the ledger, but the figures were swimming. She could feel the heat where his skin had touched hers. Then, Alden cleared his throat. He did not apologize. He did not make a joke. He just looked at his own large, scarred hand. And then he looked at hers. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, one of an awkwardness he had not felt in years. Mara saw the smile, and a mirror of it, small and hesitant, touched her own lips. She looked away from the table, out the window, at the black Rain Street glass. Her voice, when it came, was so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. "I'm not used to this," she said. He waited. He knew she was not talking about the ledger. "I'm not used to choosing." She said the word as if it were foreign, something she was still learning to pronounce. Every touch, every moment, for years. It was a command, or a theft. She turned her head back, her eyes meeting his in the warm, unsteady lamplight. I do not know how to... Just be. Alden Pike looked at her, at the scar that defined her jaw, at the profound, ancient weariness in her eyes. He thought of Lydia, and the debt he owed. He thought of this woman, who had stood beside him in the dawn, a pillar of iron. Then we will let time choose for us, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. We will let the quiet decide. The words hung in the air. The ledger was forgotten. The rain on the roof seemed to get louder, a rhythmic backdrop to the beat of his heart. Mara held his gaze. She saw no pity in his eyes. She saw no hunger. She saw only a vast, quiet respect that mirrored her own. She felt a small, strange impulse. Her body, which had been coiled tight for so long, wanted to move. She did not lean on him. She did not reach for him, but she shifted on the bench, turning her body slightly toward him, and leaned her shoulder lightly against the cool wood of the porch beam that framed the doorway. It was not a retreat. It was an alignment. A small, quiet movement toward him. He saw it. He saw the subtle invitation, the crack in the fortress, his own hand, resting on the table, ached to move, to bridge the small gap between them. But he knew, with the absolute certainty of his own broken past, that he must not be the one to take. He must only be the one to ask. Mara, he said, his voice rough. She looked at him. May I hold your hand? The question was so simple, so painfully gentle. It almost undid her. He was not asking for her body. He was not asking for her submission. He was asking for her hand. She felt a sudden, sharp sting behind her eyes, the threat of tears she had sworn off. She did not speak. She gave a single nod, slow, deliberate, and absolute. He reached his hand across the table, palm up. It was a large, scarred hand, a hand that had held a rifle, a plow, a length of rope. She looked at it for a long second, and then she placed her own hand in it. His fingers closed around hers. They were warm, dry, and impossibly strong. He did not just hold her hand, he anchored it. His thumb stroked, just once, across her knuckles. A surge of something pure and terrifying flooded Mara's chest. It was not fear, it was not passion, it was safety. A profound, bone-deep, and intoxicating safety. Her lips parted on a breath she had not realized she was holding. They sat like that, their hands clasped on the table, the rain tapping, the lamp flickering. He did not pull her closer. He did not demand more. He just held her hand, with his other hand. He reached up, moving with that same deliberate slowness that had defined him since the day she met him. She watched his hand approach. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. His fingers, calloused and gentle, were so very tender as they brushed a stray strand of hair, damp from the rain, from her cheek. He tucked it behind her ear. His touch lingered for just a second on the scar on her jawline, a touch that was not a question, but an acknowledgement. He was still holding her hand. He leaned in. She saw him coming. Her eyes did not close in fear. They fluttered shut in acceptance. His kiss was not what she expected. It was not the brutal, claiming, wet-mouthed force she had known. It was not a kiss of demand. It was a kiss of arrival. His lips were firm, dry, and warm. It was a slow, deep, and profoundly gentle pressure. It was a kiss that did not take, but gave. It was a quiet, solemn promise. He tasted of coffee in the cold night air. The scrape of his beard was a strange, new, and not unpleasant texture. And in that moment, the iron rod that had been her spine for 10 years simply dissolved. The muscles in her shoulders, which she had held high and tight for so long they had become like ridges of stone, released. She let out a small, shuddering sigh into his mouth, and her entire body, for the first time, went slack. She leaned into the kiss, her body's final, unconditional surrender. Not to him, but to this moment. The rustle of their coats was the only sound. He held the kiss for a long, timeless moment. And then, Just as gently, he pulled back. But he did not go far. They remained where they were, their foreheads touching, their eyes still closed. They were breathing the same warm, shared air. His hand was still holding hers on the table. He opened his eyes. She was close enough to see the lines at the corners of his own. A small, true smile touched his lips. "That is enough for tonight," he whispered. His self-control, his patience, was a fire far more potent than any quick passion. He was not here to consume her. He was here to shelter her. She let out a shaky laugh, a sound that felt rusty in her own throat. She did not pull away. Instead, she did something impossibly brave. She lowered her head from his and rested her cheek, just for a moment, against the rough wool of his coat, right over his heart. She closed her eyes and just listened. Thump, 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 thump. It was steady. It was strong. It was real. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of safe. A warmth bloomed from that spot, spreading through her chest, down her arms, to the very tips of her fingers, which were still laced with his. After a long beat, she lifted her head. The spell was broken, but the connection remained. She pulled her hand from his, slowly, and stood up from the table. The ledger, the war, the world, it all rushed back in. But it was different now. She walked to the door of her small room. She stopped in the threshold, her hand on the frame, her back to him. "Alden," she said, her voice quiet but carrying. He looked up. She turned her head, her profile a perfect, strong line in the lamplight. "I choose you." It was not a plea. It was not a confession of love. It was a declaration of independence. It was the statement of a free woman, claiming her right, claiming her choice. The next morning, the rain had passed. The air was scrubbed clean and cold. Mara stepped out onto the porch, her ledger in hand. Alden was in the yard, splitting firewood. The thwack of the axe a sharp, steady rhythm. He stopped, his axe buried in the chopping block. He looked up at her. Their eyes met across the yard. There was no awkwardness. There was no shame. He did not look at her with the possessiveness of a man who had won something. She did not look at him with the fear of a woman who had given something away. They simply looked at each other, and in both their eyes, there was a new, quiet, and steady fire burning, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Ephraim's snow returned 4 days later, the chestnut mare lathered and blowing hard, but otherwise unharmed. He had ridden the creek bed, slept only a few hours, and pushed hard. He found Alden and Mara on the porch, tallying the last of their supplies. He did not carry a simple verbal reply. He pulled from his coat a formal, sealed document, stamped with the territorial seal of Shiloh Fork. "Judge Loring sends his respects," Ephraim said, his voice tired but wired with adrenaline. He said it's been a long time coming." Mara broke the seal. The letter was short, the handwriting a sharp, impatient scrawl. It was a formal summons. The circuit court would be in session at Shiloh Fork in 3 days' time. It was not a trial for Burke Latimer. It was a hearing, an official gathering of testimony regarding commercial contracts and property disputes. Judge Loring had invited all parties to present their claims. "He's giving him a platform," Mara said, her voice dropping. "No," Alden said, reading the summons over her shoulder. "He's giving us one. A hearing is a trap. Burke can't resist the chance to prove he's a legitimate businessman. He'll walk right into it." 3 days later, the sun was high and bright, a cold, indifferent eye in a blue sky. Alden Pike drove the main buckboard. He sat on the bench, his Henry rifle in its scabbard by his feet. Beside him sat Mara. She was wearing one of Lydia's simpler dresses, a dark blue wool that had been mended at the cuff. It fit her poorly, but it was clean, and it was respectable. In the back of the wagon, Tamsin, Joelle, Mercy, and Bridget sat on blankets. They, too, were clean, their hair brushed and tied, their faces scrubbed. They looked like farmhands, or sisters, or any of the other anonymous, hard-working women of the territory. They did not look like property. They did not ride at dawn, or in the dusk. They rode at high noon, straight down the main road, past the turnoff to Red Willow Valley, and into the dusty, bustling main street of Shiloh Fork. They did not bow their heads. They did not hide their faces. As they passed the general store, a few men looked up, tipped their hats at Alden, and looked with curiosity at his passengers. Mara kept her chin high. Every click of the horse's hoofs on the hard-packed road was a declaration. We are not hiding. We are not ashamed. We are here. The circuit court was not held in the new, half-finished church. It was held in the Grand Saloon, the only building in town large enough to hold the crowd. The card tables had been pushed against the walls, the whiskey bottles cleared from the bar. The room smelled of sawdust, stale beer, and the sweat of too many men packed into one space. Judge Loring was a small, gray man with a face like a dried apple, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He sat at a heavy oak table, a gavel in his hand, and standing by the door, a shotgun held in the crook of her arm, was a woman. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a simple brown coat with a polished tin star pinned to it. This was Deputy Ada Bell, the town's new law, a woman who had arrived 6 months prior and had already earned a reputation for fearing nothing and hitting hard. Burke Latimer was already there. He sat at a front table, flanked by his lawyer, a slick-looking man from the city. Cole Fenwick stood behind them, his arms crossed, a sneer on his face. He looked clean, his hair oiled. He looked, for all the world, like a legitimate enforcer. The court will hear the claim of Mr. Burke Latimer, Judge Loring said, his voice cutting through the murmur. Burke's lawyer stood. He spoke for 10 minutes, his voice smooth and practiced. He spoke of investments, of contracts, of the dangers of the frontier. He presented the deeds, stamped and signed, and the bills of sale. He called a witness, a nervous-looking freighter, who swore on a Bible that he had seen Mr. Latimer purchase the contracts for the 5 women in good faith, as they were indebted labor. This is a simple matter of property, Your Honor. The lawyer concluded. Mr. Pike, in his grief, has illegally seized assets belonging to my client. Judge Loring looked at Alden. Mr. Pike, do you have a reply? Alden stood. I do not, Your Honor. The room murmured. But she does. He sat down. Mara Quintana stood up. A woman, speaking for herself in a saloon courtroom, was a spectacle. The room went dead silent. She was small, and the blue dress hung on her, but her voice was clear. Mr. Latimer is, as his lawyer says, a man of contracts. Her voice did not shake, but he is a very poor bookkeeper. He seems to have lost one of his ledgers. From a simple cloth bag at her feet, she pulled a small, battered, leather-bound book. Cole Fenwick's eyes went wide. He took 1 step forward, then stopped as Deputy Bell shifted the shotgun. We found it, Your Honor, Mara said, in a saddlebag that was left behind on the day Mr. Fenwick first visited our camp. Burke's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection, that is stolen property. It is inadmissible. Is it your property, Mr. Latimer? Judge Loring asked, his voice deceptively mild. Burke hesitated. To claim it was to own what was inside. It is a business ledger. Yes. Then it is admissible as evidence of that business. Loring nodded to Mara. Continue. I am not, Mara said. A woman of letters. I find the figures confusing. She looked, not at the judge, but at the woman with the star. Perhaps Deputy Bell could make sense of it for the court. She walked forward and placed the ledger on the table in front of Ada Bell. Ada picked it up. She opened it, and she began to read. Her voice was the only sound in the room, clear and strong. Entry, August 4th. For the keep of Tamsin. Deduction $10 for wasted food. Entry, August 9th. For mercy. Deduction $5 for necessary correction. A low growl moved through the crowd. These were not wages. They were debts, Ada continued, her voice hardening. Entry August 12th, for Joelle. Deduction $20 for lodging and clothing. Entry August 14th, for Bridget. Deduction $1 for use of light and air. Air, someone in the back whispered. He's charging them for air. The atmosphere in the room had changed. It was no longer a property dispute. It was an unveiling. Ada Bell did not look up. Your Honor, the court has one more witness. She turned to the door. Mr. Hastian. A man stepped inside. He was Navajo, his hair in 2 long braids, his face a mask of dignified calm. He was Tal Hastian, the most respected guide in the territory, a man who knew every rock and river from here to the border. Ada held up one of Burke's deeds of sale. Mr. Hastian, the defense would like you to read this description. Mr. Latimer claims these women were purchased from a roving Apache comfort camp. Tal Hastian looked at the paper, then at Burke, his eyes filled with a quiet contempt. He spoke, his English slow and precise. I have guided men in this land for 30 years. I know the Apache. I know their camps. He shook his head. There is no such thing. Apache women are not comfort. They are mothers. They are daughters. They are wives. This, he tapped the paper. This is a white man's name. It is a lie used to sell what is not yours to sell. The room was stone cold. Burke Latimer's face was pale. His lawyer was shuffling his papers, his slick confidence gone. Judge Loring raised his head. Mr. Latimer, this court finds your contracts to be fraudulent. They are not deeds of sale. They are ledgers of extortion and slavery. He picked up his pen. These documents are null and void. He did not stop. Furthermore, based on this testimony and this ledger, I am issuing a warrant for the arrest of Burke Latimer and Cole Fenwick on the charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit. Deputy Bell, Loring said, serve your warrant. The world exploded. You won't take me, Burke Latimer screamed. He was not a businessman anymore. He was a cornered rat. He kicked the table over, and in the same motion, his hand dived inside his fine coat. He pulled a small, silver-plated derringer. He wasn't aiming at the judge. He was aiming at Mara. Bang! The sound of the shot was deafening in the enclosed room. But Alden Pike had been waiting for this exact moment. He was not a rancher. He was a cavalryman. He did not draw his gun. He moved. In the second it took Burke to aim, Alden had crossed the space, grabbing Mara by the waist and throwing both of them to the floor, crashing into the sawdust just as the bullet tore through the air where she had been standing. The room erupted. Cole Fenwick lunged, his hand going for his own holster, but Ephraim and 2 ranchers from the crowd, who had been waiting for this, tackled him, a mass of flying limbs. Deputy Bell did not fire. She brought the butt of her shotgun up, catching Burke square under the jaw with a sickening thud. He stumbled back, his shot gone wild, before he could recover. 6 men from the town, the militia, the blacksmith, the ranchers he had sneered at were on him, pinning his arms, tearing the gun from his hand. It was over in 5 seconds. Alden pushed himself off Mara, his hands checking her for wounds. Are you hit? Are you hit? No, she gasped. The air knocked from her, covered in dirt and spit. I am not. He pulled her to her feet. The room was a wreck of overturned chairs. Ada Bell was dragging a dazed, bleeding Burke Latimer up, snapping iron cuffs onto his wrists. You bitch! Burke spat at Mara, his voice thick. You think this changes anything? You think they'll see you as anything but what you are? Mara walked past Alden. She walked through the debris, her blue dress torn at the knee, until she stood in the center of the room. She was holding a small, folded piece of paper. My name, she said, her voice ringing in the sudden silence, is Mara Quintana. She unfolded the paper. Her name is Tamsin Hale. Her name is Joelle Finch. Her name is Mercy Lowell. Her name is Bridget O'Rourke. The room was silent. This was not a legal document. It was a sermon. Her name, Mara continued, her voice gaining strength, was Elodie from New Orleans, sold for $40. Her name was Sarah, taken from a farm in Ohio. Her name was Min Jun, from the railroad camps. Her name was... She read the list of every woman she had known in Burke's camps. Every name he had tried to erase. Each one was a hammer blow. As she finished, the church bell outside began to ring, signaling the noon hour. The sound filled the saloon. A clear, bright peal of judgment. Ada Bell shoved the cuffed and silent Burke toward the door. The town, in a single, silent mass, parted to let them through, watching a shadow empire, built on paper and cruelty, collapse into the light. When the room was empty, Judge Loring sat down, his face gray with exhaustion. Ada will set a formal trial date, but this... He signed the last paper with a flourish. This is for today. He handed it to Mara. It was a writ of protection and a confirmation of their free labor status, recognized by the territory. He handed her the pen. She signed her name, Mara Quintana. She passed the pen to Joelle, who signed with a steady hand. Tamsin signed, her letters shaky but clear. Mercy's was slow and careful. When it came to Bridget, she looked at the pen, then at Mara. She took it, and in the final space, she made a single, clear, defiant X. They were, in the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of the town, free. The ride back from Shiloh Fork was not a retreat. It was a procession. Alden Pike drove the main buckboard, his shoulders set, his Henry rifle resting in its scabbard. Mara sat beside him on the bench, not as a refugee, but as a partner. In the back, the women were not huddled. They sat up, watching the territory pass, watching the land that was no longer their prison, but their home. When they arrived back at the Red Willow Valley, the air was different. The wind still cut across the plains, but the high, thin, screaming sound of menace was gone. It was just wind. They did not rest. The next day, Alden and Ephraim took the wagon down to the small cottonwood grove by the creek. The sharp, clean sound of an axe began to echo through the valley. They were not repairing. They were building. "What is it?" Joelle asked, watching from the porch as a new foundation was laid. "The house is big enough for us." Alden, sinking his axe into a fresh log, paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. He looked at Mara, who was directing Ephraim on where to place the next stone. "We are building a new barn," Alden said, his voice loud enough for them all to hear. "The old one." He glanced at the structure that had been their first, terrified sanctuary. "The old one holds too many ghosts." But it was not a barn. As the walls went up, it was too small, too tight. It was a cabin, solid and low, with 2 rooms, a strong door, and a fireplace built of river stone. It took them 2 weeks of hard, honest labor. Tamsin and Bridget cooked for the builders, hauling pots of hot stew. Mercy, using the white mare, dragged the logs from the grove. Her low voice giving commands the horse obeyed without question. When it was finished, Alden took a plank of smooth pine, sanded clean by Tamsin. He took a hot poker from the new fire. He burned letters, deep and black, into the wood. Catherine's Haven. He nailed it above the door. Mara stood beside him, her hand resting on the new door frame. It was Tamsin who finally asked the question, her voice quiet. "Who was Catherine?" Alden looked at the name, the heat from the poker still rising from the wood. "She was my wife," he said. The words came easier now, the sharp, broken edges of the memory worn smooth. "She was the one I failed to protect." Mara reached out, not to Alden, but to the sign. Her fingers traced the burned, raised letters. "No," she said, her voice soft but certain. "She is the one you are still protecting. This house, this is her vow." Alden looked at her and understood. The debt was not paid. It was transformed. Inside the main room of the Haven, they hung another board, this one larger. Mara had taken the charcoal and written the words, and Alden had burned them in. It was not a list of rules, not a set of laws. It was a charter, a declaration. Respect, choice, no status exchanged. They were the 3 pillars of this new world. respect for the body, the mind, and the boundary. The choice to stay, to leave, to speak, or to be silent. And the final, most important covenant, this was not a trade. Sanctuary was not a debt. A hot meal was not a down payment. Life in this valley was not a commodity. The haven became the new heart of the ranch, and the women, no longer survivors, became its masters. Joelle, whose hands had been steadied by the earth, took over the gardens and the root cellar, but she had also found the small crate of books that had belonged to Lydia. In the evenings, by the light of the fire in the haven, she began to teach. Tamsin and Mercy, their heads bent close, their fingers tracing the letters, learned to read their own names. Joelle, who had been silenced by terror, was now the one giving voice to others. Mercy's gift with the white mare had become a quiet legend. Alden, seeing her skill, bought 2 more horses from a neighboring ranch, both difficult, broken-spirited animals. Mercy did not break them. She mended them. She took over the old barn, her low, constant murmuring and the smell of the hay creating a new kind of sanctuary. She was healing the horses, and they, in their silent, non-judgmental way, were healing her. Tamsin and Bridget, the 2 who had been the most fragile, became the twin pillars of the domestic world. They managed the kitchen, the stores, the sewing. Tamsin, who had mended the leather, now mended their lives, her stitches small and perfect. Bridget, the silent one, was the soul of the house. She had not spoken a single word since her arrival, but she did not need to. Her silence was no longer an absence. It was a profound, watchful strength. She was the firekeeper, the bread baker. She was the first one up in the cold dark, and the last one to rest. 2 weeks after the trial, Deputy Ada Bell rode out from Shiloh Fork. She was not on official business. She had 2 women with her, rail-thin and hollow-eyed, runaways from a mining camp saloon up north. "Heard you had a room," Ada said. It was not a question. Mara stepped off the porch. "We have 2, she said. The network, the one Mara had only dreamed of, began to form. It was a railway of whispers, a map of safe harbors. Tal Hestian, the Navajo guide, would stop by on his routes. He would drink coffee, accept a hot meal, and before he left, he would trace a new line on Alden's map of the territory, a safe path through the canyons. A freshwater spring no one else knew. A rancher who would turn a blind eye. The Red Willow Valley Ranch was no longer a place of isolation. It was a station. The first snows of winter were beginning to dust the high ridges. The air was sharp as glass, the sky a hard, painful blue. The work was done for the day. From the haven, a sound drifted up, a strange, wonderful sound. Laughter. Real, easy, unburdened laughter. Joelle was trying to teach Ephraim a simple dance step, and he was failing, to everyone's delight. Alden Pike stood on the small ridge behind the main house, his coat pulled tight. He was looking at a simple wooden cross, weathered gray by 5 years of wind. Mara came up the hill behind him, her steps silent on the hard ground. She was carrying a small, tight bunch of dried prairie flowers she had saved from the summer. She did not speak. She just came to stand beside him, sharing the view. "This is her," he said quietly. Mara nodded. She knelt in the hard, cold dirt and laid the flowers at the base of the cross. She did not pray. She spoke, her voice for the wind and the woman beneath the soil. "Catherine," she whispered, her hand resting on the packed earth. "My name is Mara. He is safe. We are fixing the world, the way I think you wished it would be." She stood up. Alden was watching her, his face carved by the low, golden light of the setting sun. The grief was still in his eyes. It would always be, but it no longer owned him. It was just a part of him, like the scars on his hands. He did not ask with his voice. His eyes asked. He held his hand out, palm up. She took it. He stepped closer. She met him halfway. He kissed her. It was not the hesitant, questioning kiss from the rainy night. It was not the desperate, clinging kiss of survivors. This was the kiss of partners. It was mature, earned, and absolute. It was warm against the cold air, a quiet, profound confirmation of all that had passed and all that was to come. It was the kiss of two people who had seen the worst of the world and had chosen, together, to build something better in its place. It was a kiss that tasted of pride and of pine and of a future that was, finally, their own. They broke apart, but he kept her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. They stood together, watching the sun bleed its last colors onto the snow-capped hills, listening to the impossible sound of laughter echoing up from the valley below. The final letter from Shiloh Fork arrived a week later, brought by Ada Bell. The trial had been swift, with Mara's ledger, Tal Hastings' testimony, and the word of 3 other women Ada had found. Burke Latimer and Cole Fenwick had been sentenced 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. "There's more," Ada said, handing Mara a bank draft. "The judge declared all his assets forfeit, his properties, his cash. It's all been seized." It was a large sum of money. "What is this?" Mara asked. "The first deposit," Ada said, a rare, thin smile touching her lips. "For the victims' fund, Judge Loring said Catherine's Haven seemed like the right place to administer it." That night, Mara sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, the women asleep in the haven. She opened the ledger, the old supply book that had become their book of life. She turned past the counts of flour and salt. She turned to the first blank page. She took the pen, the good one Alden had bought in town. She dipped it in the ink. Her hand was perfectly steady. She wrote Mara Quintana. Beneath it, Tamsin Hale, Joelle Finch, Mercy Lowell, Bridget O'Rourke. The names were written in bold, clear, black ink. They were not trembling. They were not apologies. They were not property. They were a foundation. In a land where the wind scours the courage from a man's soul, where the law had once belonged only to the strong and the cruel, one small house in a valley chose not to take. One man, bound by a debt to his ghosts, chose to stand. And one woman, who had been called property, chose to be free. And from that choice, in that small patch of dirt and defiance, everything changed. Thank you for listening to this story. I am curious, where in the world are you listening from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you can support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by many more.